I got that, that one drip that goes right down your spine. Passes the belt line and you're just demotivating.
It's only going to get worse.
Oh yeah. Let some of the steam out of here before we get started. Have you turned it on already?
Yes.
Okay.
I gave it thumbs up.
That's great for the whole world to see. Good morning. Welcome to the English Sunday School class. We're going to try something a little bit different today with no jackets and sitting down. Maybe I'll make it out of here without having to wipe sweat off my face. Amen. So last week we covered the beauty and complexity of ecosystems, and we saw how they support the biblical creation worldview. One of the key terms last week was symbiosis. Today's lesson will address that very concept as we transition toward evidence from animal life, slowly but surely. So, evidence from symbiosis. Does anybody remember what symbiosis is? I'll answer for you. It is a close ecological relationship between the individuals of two or more different species. And sometimes a symbiotic relationship can benefit both species involved. Sometimes one species benefits at the other's expense. And in other cases, neither species benefits. We'll cover a few of the many examples of symbiotic relationships, but today we'll focus on plants and their pollinators, or the species that aid them in reproduction and propagation. Beginning with the Bible, we know that flowering plants and trees were created on day 3, and their animal pollinators were created on day 5 and day 6. Birds, nectar bats, flying insects, flying animals were created on day 5, and then the crawling creatures on day 6. God created in such a way that beneficial partnership could readily form between the members of various plant kinds and animal kinds to be fully capable of adjusting and adapting as new and different environments were encountered. And again, by adapting, I mean the variation within a kind adaptation, not the evolutionary fairy tale of adapting from one kind to another kind. As the plant and the pollinator kinds spread across the earth after the flood, which we see in Genesis 8:17, these relationships could have been reestablished or perhaps new and amazing relationships could have been formed. Genesis 8:17, God tells Noah, "Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee, of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth." That was a command. Being created with the ability to adapt can produce unique symbiont pairs. It's the descriptive term for pair of species in a symbiotic relationship. The great variety in color, shape, pattern, and scent that we observe in flowers is a direct result of the intimate association of flowers with their pollinating partner. So let's start with pollinators. Though there are relationships that are not mutually beneficial or that are mutually not beneficial, right? We're not going to cover those today. We will look at the concept of mutualism, or mutually beneficial pollinator and animal relationships. The plant in that mutualistic relationship expends less energy in pollen production and instead produces showy flowers, nectar, and or odors. A flower that attracts specific pollinators on a regular basis has an advantage of wasting less pollen versus those flowers that attract promiscuous pollinators that just run through everything. The pollinator itself gains an advantage of having its own private food source, thereby exerting less energy in competition with other species and searching. The plant must supply, though, a reward, that's the nectar and pollen, an attractant, that's brightly colored flowers and odors, and a mechanism for pollen transfer. Most pollen molecules, granules, if you will, are roughly shaped and designed in such a way that they can catch easily on the pollinators. And most pollinators, like the bee that you see here, have very hairy bodies so they can collect a lot of pollen as they move around. Some, on the other hand, do not. Successful fertilization that follows pollination of a flowering plant produces the growth of seeds and fruit. Although some plants rely on the wind to pollinate, like cereal plants, and some rely on water, aquatic plants, to transfer pollen from one flower to the other, the vast majority, 90% of all plant species, need the help of animals for pollination. So pollinators play an important role in maintaining diverse plant communities that provide food for wildlife and ensure pollination for approximately 35% of the food crops worldwide. Farmers in the United States, specifically, that's where I have the data from, depend upon pollinators to produce a wide variety of fruits and vegetables, including, well, that's kind of squished, not bad, including apples and almonds, berries, cherries, cucumbers, melons, squash, sunflowers. These insect-pollinated foods, plus indirect food products, such as milk that we get from cows that are fed by pollinated alfalfa, represent 15 to 30% of all foods consumed in the United States. Though there are many plant-pollinator relationships that we could look at between insects, birds, and mammals, which we'll continue to look at through the next couple of weeks, today we will focus on figs. The fig tree is a cornerstone species in many tropical ecosystems. Every modern species of fig, and there are around 900 of them, I didn't know that, is pollinated by its own species of fig wasp. Yeah. Figs are unusual fruits because their flowers are actually inside the immature fruit called a syconium. So you see in this picture, there's a syconium and there are figs at different levels of maturity. So at this point, the flowers are not on the outside, they're inside. Being inside, protected inside the syconium, how do they ever get pollinated? Good question. When the female flowers, there are male and female flowers, right? When the female flowers inside this immature fruit are ready for pollination, the fruit emits an odor, an aroma, that attracts only the female wasps of the specific type necessary to pollinate that tree. Fig wasps enter through a tiny pore down here to mate, lay eggs, and pollinate the tiny flowers. Carrying pollen from the fig in which she developed, this is going to be a whole chicken and the egg thing, it's going to be a fig wasp thing. Okay? From carrying pollen from the fig in which she developed, the fig wasp deposits her eggs in some of the flowers, while pollinating others of them. When her eggs hatch and the larvae develop, the males fertilize the females, dig exits for them, and then die. The males are born without wings. Their only existence is to hatch inside the fig, fertilize the females that are still in their egg form, dig an exit, and then die. The females, when they mature, they leave the fig through the exit, and they're laden with pollen, and they go find another syconium that they're drawn to by the aroma in which to lay their eggs. Because the fig's flowers are enclosed inside, they need the fig wasp in order to pollinate them, in order for them to help them get fertilized. And the best edible figs, right? There are edible figs and not edible figs of those 900 species. The best edible figs require internal fertilization. There are figs that do not require the fig wasp to be inside. We'll talk about that in a minute, but those aren't typically the edible kind. Female wasps die inside the fig that they fertilize, but they've gained a reproduction resource from the fig fruit. Thus, figs and fig wasps need each other in this mutually beneficial biological arrangement. You can see a whole lot more information here than what I gave you, but that's on your notes so you can follow up with it. So the question here is confusion or conclusion, right? Until recently, the evolutionary story of the fig and the fig wasp was an equally marvelous match of co-evolving mutualism, in their own words. Based on known fossils, their assumption-ridden dating methods, and a little imagination, like we covered a couple weeks ago, evolutionists believe that figs and fig wasps have been evolving together for about 60 million years. Now, the identification of an ancient but anatomically modern fig wasp from a quarry in Brazil's lower Cretaceous Crato Formation, which is, by the way, dated at about 115 million years because it's Cretaceous, has led them to believe that the modern fig wasp's fine-tuned form evolved 65 million years before the first fig was ever seen on the earthly landscape. Of course, like we discussed in recent weeks, the plastic theory of evolution allows for constant change as well as stasis over millions of years. Because why would you question your theory? Their official conclusion from discovering these wasp fossils was that complex relationships that exist today between the fig wasp and their host tree developed more than 34 million years ago and have remained unchanged since then. Hogwash. That wasp is anatomically identical to that wasp because God created them a little less than 6,000 years ago, and they haven't changed since the flood. It's okay to say they haven't changed in a couple thousand years. It's not okay to say they haven't changed in 35, 65, or 115 million years. Okay? So, as I mentioned, not all figs need to be pollinated by a fig wasp, right? Some just need to be fertilized, not pollinated. Some fig wasps have this tail-like device called an ovipositor. So they stand up and they shove that thing straight through the fruit and they deposit their eggs inside just so that they can then grow out of the fruit, as opposed to having to carry pollen on their body and climb inside of it to fertilize the fruit itself. But that also means they don't have to enter and die. It's just a little bit different. But that's still a fig wasp. Whether it has an ovipositor or it doesn't have an ovipositor, whether it dies inside of a fig or it dies outside of a fig, we're still all in agreement, right? This is a fig wasp. This isn't a bumblebee. This isn't a cow, right? This is not a bird. Okay. So when we consider the history in the Bible, the fossil record of fig wasps compared to modern fig wasps makes sense. Okay. Only evolutionary worldview-based, unverifiable conclusions about the age of the earth and molecules to man evolution produce confusion. God's eyewitness account makes it clear that he created all kinds of plants on the third day of creation week, just about 6,000 years ago. Only 2 days later, on day 5 and then day 6, he created flying creatures. God created all kinds of plants and animals fully... Well, that's pretty blurry. I guess that was a smaller photo than I thought. God created all kinds of plants and animals fully functional and fully able to reproduce and vary within their created kinds. The existence of varieties of fig wasps able to lay their eggs within the fig's flowering body without entering does not represent evolution of any new kind of creature. It's just a variation, helping it to lay its eggs without providing pollination services to the host plant. None of this demonstrates evolution of new kinds of plants and animals, only variations of the kinds that God created. The Bible also reports the historical occurrence of a global flood. This catastrophic event explains much of the fossil record, not as a record of the presumed evolution of new forms of life, but a record of the catastrophic burial of billions of organisms. Brazil's Lower Cretaceous Crater Formation, which is a rich source of insect fossils, is not a stony record of evolution, but rather of the global flood. Biblical history enables geologists to interpret the fossil record in light of the Bible's history. Dr. Andrew Snelling is on staff with Answers in Genesis, and he explains about this particular situation. As being considered Lower Cretaceous, that means that this level of sediment was deposited at the last peak of the floodwaters before they retreated. So that makes the formation's deposition a little before day 150 of the flood at the latest. Total flood inundation globally would of course leave insects with nowhere much to land except on floating debris, but they would still be vulnerable to rapid burial, which of course is the only way they could be preserved as fossils. The reason we don't see as many fossilized humans is because humans are smart enough to try to avoid being quickly buried by mudslides. They're going to get to higher ground, they're going to swim for their life until they can't swim anymore, and then they're going to drown and they're going to decay. And if they're not rapidly covered with sediment of some kind, they will decay instead of fossilize, right? And that's why we have so few fossilized humans. Because they were smart. Not because they were dumb and we're smart, because they were smart. We should therefore not be surprised to find many modern appearing organisms in the fossil record. And since the dates assigned to the fig wasp and the dates assigned to figs are based on unverifiable evolutionary assumptions, the conundrum that they supposedly present is non-existent. The answer is indeed in Genesis. All kinds of plants were created able to reproduce and able to vary within their kinds. You see that in Genesis 1:11 through 13 and Exodus 20:11. Figs did not have to evolve or to co-evolve with pollinating insects, as evolutionists generally assert. God created plants and pollinators the same week. The plant and the pollinator have adapted together under God's original design. Some species, like the fig and the fig wasp, have unique, harmonious relationships that could not have arisen randomly or millions of years apart from each other. Without a fig to grow up in, the fig wasp couldn't live. Without a fig wasp to pollinate the fig couldn't live. The variation within each of God's created kinds is truly astonishing. We'll likely be on symbiosis for the next few lessons. There's so many different things to address, I didn't want to try to get them all into one lesson. So next week we're going to look at pollinators of the bird and mammal variety and how they help out plants and how plants help out them. And pending any questions?
So if you break open a fig, you might find a wasp?
If you get it open early, so by the time that it fully ripens, the fertilization that makes all of the fruit portion, if you remember the Zirconium picture, there's no red color in it, right? It's all green on the outside and really thick white meat of the membrane here, and then all the flowers are inside. So then the flowers, once it's fertilized, starts to create this ripened fruit, and it will have consumed all of the dead wasps inside. Depending on when you cut it open, you can definitely, if you can look on the internet, there are lots of photos of them cutting open Zirconiums, or the immature fruits, and there's wasps crawling all through them. But then you've now messed up the whole life cycle. Good job. Because we want to see it, right? Like what we talked about before, disturbing ecosystems. But yeah, this also is not one of the craziest wasp stories. There's a desert wasp that's kind of in the same gig of being out in the sand and stuff, and the male wasp doesn't have wings. He spends his whole life like digging a hole for his mate to be able to plant her eggs in and then bury it up. But he dies digging the hole. She plants the egg, she buries it, and she she goes off somewhere else. Just interesting, differences. And honeybees are a lot the same way. You know, we'll do a week on honeybees probably. They're probably one of the most important pollinators on the planet. Definitely one of the most prolific pollinators. Almost, that one picture that I had up of the foods that I said was squenched, everything on that is actually pollinated by bees. And they play lots of important roles, but the things that I've learned about how the queen bee functions within the hive, and how all the other, there are two different types of the male bees and
Drones
and the workers. Yeah. So, but then they know when the queen is going to die, and they can make one of her eggs become a queen, and how they handle it in order to, or if the hive is getting too big, they can decide, okay, we're going to split this down the middle, and half of these bees are going to leave, and we're going to start another hive, but we need to make one of these, we need to make a queen, so that we can have a queen over here too. And just constant addressing of that, balancing their like, if we only have this much space, there can only be this many bees here to make this honey. And it's just, they figure it out. God's designed them to be able to figure it out. Ants are a lot the same way. We can do a whole couple of weeks on ants. You know, Solomon said that. Go to the ant. They're remarkable. But I don't think that any of us have eaten a fully ripened fig with wasps in it. It may have wasp DNA in it, where it's broken down part of the protein.